The clock ticks, each second bringing us closer to an ending. A stark, quiet exterior shot of the Huntsville unit, the place where countless fates are sealed. Inside, in the shadows, the execution chamber waits. In the distance, the apartment in Houston where it all began, the brutal murders of a mother and her twin daughters. A cold, haunting silence lingers. For 30 long years, Garcia Glenn White's name haunted the halls of justice. His crime, a grotesque memory, left unanswered questions that only time could attempt to bury. But time was ticking down, bringing White to his final moment in 2024. Was this justice, or something more sinister? Hey there, I'm glad you're here. In today's case, I'll take you through the timeline of Garcia Glenn White, a story of murder, years of waiting, and a final moment that left with more questions than answers. Where were you when the verdict was final? Comment below. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into this chilling case. Garcia Glenn White was born on February 4th, 1963 in Houston, Texas, a city that would become central to his story of crime and punishment. Houston, known for its bustling streets and complex social fabric, was the backdrop of his early life, a life marked by struggle and a slow descent into trouble. Growing up in Houston, Garcia's childhood seemed far from the normal dreams of a young boy. His family life was fractured, leaving him to navigate a turbulent environment where trouble seemed to lurk around every corner. By his early teens, Garcia was already facing challenges that many of his peers could not understand. Trouble at school, rebellious behavior, and a series of encounters with the law that would define his teenage years. As the years passed, it became clear that Garcia was losing his way. School was a distant memory, replaced by the constant lure of drugs and the life that came with it. The drugs became an escape, a way to drown out the chaos around him. He began to fall into the dark underworld of Houston, where addiction and violence often went hand in hand. In a city where ambition and dreams are just as common as crime, Garcia's path seemed set, a spiral downward with few moments of clarity. Employment was a fleeting concept for Garcia. As the years went on, jobs became a rare commodity, a constant struggle for survival. The idea of building a future seemed irrelevant, and his involvement in illegal activities only deepened. It was clear to those around him that Garcia was slipping through the cracks, unable or unwilling to pull himself out of a cycle that was threatening to consume him. But details of Garcia's early life remain scarce, and much of the truth about his upbringing remains hidden in the shadows. There are few records of his childhood, and what we do know comes from fragments of unreliable accounts. His psychological history is murky at best. No concrete answers about his mental state or whether any early interventions could have saved him from the path he ultimately chose. What we know is this: the foundation of his life was unstable, fractured by family troubles and a lack of support, with no clear road to recovery. This early period of Garcia's life raises a question that would echo throughout his case. Could things have been different? Could a different kind of support, a different kind of intervention, have changed the course of his life? Or was this the inevitable outcome for someone who, from an early age, was shaped by the shadows of addiction and violence? The truth of his beginnings is unclear, but one thing is certain. Garcia Glenn White was a product of his environment, and that environment would shape him in ways that no one could have predicted, leading him to a crime so shocking it would make him one of the most notorious figures in Houston's criminal history. The next chapter in Garcia's life would be the one that would set the stage for the events that would haunt Houston for years to come, leading to an investigation that would take far longer than anyone could have imagined. But for now, Garcia's origins remain a puzzle, a piece of the larger picture of a man who was both shaped by his circumstances and, ultimately, a creature of his own making. It was December of 1989, a time when the holiday season was supposed to bring warmth, family, and peace. But in one Houston apartment, those hopes were shattered. The apartment of Bonita Edwards and her 16-year-old twin daughters, Annette and Bernette, would become the site of a horrific crime that would haunt the city for decades to come. Bonita Edwards was a mother trying to make a life for herself and her daughters in the tough environment of Houston. They lived in an apartment complex that, like so many others, had its share of problems, crime, drugs, and the ever-present struggle to survive. The three of them had been through their own set of challenges, but they remained close, finding solace in each other. But this December, their lives would come to a brutal and shocking end. Garcia Glenn White, a man whose name would soon become synonymous with the grisly murders of these three innocent lives, arrived at their apartment on that fateful night. White, in his troubled state, had his own reasons for being there. The lure of drugs, the craving that had taken hold of him for years, was the draw. He had known Bonita for some time, and their interactions were likely fueled by the shared connection of substance abuse, a common thread in White's tumultuous life. But what started as a drug deal, or possibly just a gathering, would quickly spiral into something much darker. Bonita and her daughters were viciously attacked. White, in a fit of rage, turned on them. It was reported that a violent confrontation erupted, and in the chaos that ensued, Bonita and her daughters were stabbed repeatedly. The brutality of the attack is almost incomprehensible. A mother and her children, who had once shared their home with love and hope, were reduced to helpless victims of a man who had long since lost his way. The bodies of Bonita, Annette, and Bernette Edwards were discovered on December 2nd, 1989. A neighbour, concerned about the absence of any activity or the failure to hear from Bonita, went to the apartment to check. What they found inside was a scene that would be seared into their memory forever. 3 lifeless bodies, each bearing the marks of a violent end. The crime scene was chilling. There were signs of a brutal struggle, with evidence that pointed to a calculated attack rather than a spur-of-the-moment outburst. Bonita and her daughters had been stabbed multiple times, their lives taken in a merciless manner. The nature of the crime, the sheer violence of it, shocked the investigators. It was a massacre, plain and simple, and the authorities knew immediately that this wasn't a random act of violence. Someone had targeted them, and that someone was about to become a name that would echo in the halls of Houston's criminal justice system for years to come. As the investigation began, the authorities had few leads to follow. The crime was brutal, but it didn't seem to fit the usual patterns of gang violence or random assaults. No one in the community could believe that Bonita and her daughters had been caught in the crossfire of a random act of violence. They were just a family, living in an apartment, trying to survive. Who would want to hurt them? Despite the brutality of the scene, the investigation into the murders initially hit a dead end. There were no immediate suspects, and no one in the apartment complex reported anything unusual the night of the murders. The Houston Police Department began to investigate, but found themselves grasping at straws, unable to make any connections. Then, as the days went on, the investigators began to uncover pieces of evidence that pointed toward Garcia Glenn White. The initial breakthrough came from a seemingly unrelated investigation, a string of drug-related crimes that had been ongoing in the area. White had been involved in several incidents that raised red flags for the police. He had a history of violent outbursts, and his name had come up in other investigations. But it wasn't until DNA evidence and a series of confessions that the case finally began to come together. As the pieces of the puzzle slowly clicked into place, it became clear that Garcia Glenn White was the person responsible for the deaths of Bonita and her daughters. His involvement would later be confirmed through forensic evidence, blood samples, fingerprints, and eventually White's own confession. But even as the evidence mounted, there were still questions left unanswered. Some aspects of the case remained in dispute. For instance, there were conflicting reports about whether others were involved in the crime. White himself was known to have lied during initial questioning, suggesting that someone else had been involved in the murders. But as the investigation progressed, it became clear that White acted alone. His defense team would later argue that drugs and his mental state played a role in the violence. But the prosecution remained firm. The brutality of the crime was clear, and there was no doubt about White's role in the murders. Toxicology reports and psychological evaluations would later show that White was under the influence of drugs at the time of the killings, but whether that fully excused the brutality of his actions remained a matter of debate. Some argued that his drug use, his psychosis, and his troubled past were factors that influenced his behavior. But the murders of Bonita, Annette, and Bernette were, at the end of the day, the result of White's own choices. Choices he would have to answer for. Despite these contested details, the truth remained. 3 lives were brutally taken in cold blood. The bodies of Bonita and her daughters were discovered, and the city of Houston was left to process the horror of what had transpired within the walls of a simple apartment. This crime would remain unsolved for years, becoming a cold case that would linger in the hearts of those who knew the victims, and in the minds of the investigators who were determined to find the truth. It was a case that seemed to defy reason, a crime that seemed too senseless to comprehend. But, like so many other stories, it would eventually unfold, piece by piece, revealing the chilling truth behind one of the most disturbing murders in Houston's history. And so, as the investigation began to gain traction, Garcia Glenn White's name started to rise to the surface. It would take years for the full truth to come out, but with each new lead, with each new piece of evidence, the story of what really happened that night in 1989 became clearer. And the question remained, how could a crime so brutal, so senseless, go unsolved for so long? And what had Garcia Glenn White done to make sure that, for years, he was able to remain free? The answers to these questions would slowly come together over the next several years. But for now, the city of Houston could only wait for the justice that seemed so elusive. As investigators pieced together the horrifying details of the murders of Bonita Edwards and her twin daughters, Annette and Bernette, another chilling revelation began to emerge. Garcia Glenn White had confessed to even more killings. While he had been convicted for the triple homicide in 1996, White's confessions suggested a far darker history. Between 1989 and 1995, 2 additional victims were named, Greta Williams and Hai Pham. These murders were never officially prosecuted, but White's admissions, combined with circumstantial evidence, suggested that his violent tendencies had claimed more lives than anyone had anticipated. The first of these suspected victims, Greta Williams, was killed in 1989, the same year as the Edwards family murders. White's confession revealed that he had been involved in her death during a violent encounter. However, the details surrounding Williams' death were sparse. The case was never fully investigated with the same intensity as the Edwards murders, and Greta Williams' family was left with more questions than answers. White's admissions were the only pieces of evidence that linked him to her death, and the lack of formal investigation meant that there was never any concrete evidence to charge him for this crime. The exact circumstances of her murder remain unclear, but her name would be forever tied to White's string of killings. In 1995, another victim emerged, Hai Pham, a grocery store owner who had been found dead in Houston under suspicious circumstances. Initially thought to be a robbery gone wrong, Pham's murder would later be connected to White after his arrest in July 1995. White, while in custody, confessed to killing Pham, further expanding the scope of his violent behavior. At the time, Pham's death had been treated as a tragic yet isolated incident, but White's involvement cast a shadow over what was once considered a routine case. Despite these confessions, the murders of Greta Williams and Hai Pham were never formally brought to trial. There was insufficient evidence to charge White for either crime, and both cases remained cold. The authorities were left with a nagging question: how many more lives had White claimed during his rampage of violence? The lack of closure in these cases added another layer of complexity to White's already disturbing history. His confessions, while chilling, did little to bring justice to the families of these victims. The full extent of his crimes may never be fully understood, leaving a sense of unease that White's violent legacy could be even darker than anyone had realized. In the years following the brutal murders of Bonita Edwards and her twin daughters, Annette and Bernette, the case had slowly begun to cold. With little evidence and no clear leads, it seemed as though the city of Houston had resigned itself to never knowing the full truth. But justice, as it often does in the world of true crime, has a way of catching up. Garcia Glenn White's name had circulated in police circles, but it wasn't until May 28, 1996, that he was formally indicted by a grand jury in Harris County, Texas, for the capital murder of the Edwards family. The indictment came after years of speculation, evidence gathering, and mounting pressure to solve the case. White's involvement in the brutal killings, which had remained shrouded in mystery for so long, was finally made official. The grand jury's decision was the result of a breakthrough in the case, a confession from White himself. In the face of mounting evidence, including DNA and serology testing that linked White's blood and semen to the crime scene, the case against him was building. It was not just the confession that sealed his fate, but the scientific evidence that tied him to the horrific scene where 3 innocent lives had been taken. By the time the trial rolled around later that year, White's defense team attempted to challenge the reliability of the forensic evidence. The DNA and serology tests used to link White to the murders came from the Houston Police Department's crime lab, a lab that, at the time, had faced numerous accusations of mishandling evidence and producing unreliable results. These concerns would become a focal point of White's defense, questioning whether the evidence was contaminated or improperly processed. But despite these challenges, the court remained steadfast in its ruling. The jury convicted White of capital murder for the deaths of Bonita, Annette, and Bernette Edwards. The trial was a moment of reckoning for a family who had spent years in the shadow of an unsolved crime. The brutal nature of the murders, combined with the damning evidence against White, left little doubt in the minds of the jury. Garcia Glenn White was sentenced to death. This conviction marked a turning point for the city of Houston, but for the Edwards family, it was just the beginning of a long, painful road toward closure. White's conviction would be followed by years of appeals and legal battles, but the reality of the crime he had committed was undeniable. His fate had been sealed, but the lingering questions surrounding the case would persist for many years to come. The execution that awaited him in 2024 would bring the final chapter to a long and torturous saga, but it wouldn't erase the pain or the uncertainty that had haunted Houston for so long. Even after Garcia Glenn White was convicted for the murders of Bonita Edwards and her twin daughters, Annette and Bernette, his story did not end with the verdict. In the years that followed his sentencing, a series of legal battles would unfold, casting doubt over the fairness of his execution and raising complex questions about mental health, intellectual disability, and the reliability of the evidence that led to his conviction. White's legal team, determined to prevent his execution, centered much of their defense on the claim that he had an intellectual disability. Under the landmark Supreme Court ruling in Atkins v. Virginia, 2002, it was determined that executing individuals with intellectual disabilities was unconstitutional. White's attorneys argued that he should be excluded from the death penalty on the grounds that his mental faculties were impaired. The claim was based on the idea that White's intellectual abilities were significantly below the average threshold, making him constitutionally ineligible for execution. For years, his legal team filed appeals, pointing to his IQ score and asserting that his low score, measured at around 78, should qualify him for exclusion from the death penalty. However, while the Atkins decision had set a precedent, proving intellectual disability was not a straightforward task. White's defense struggled to meet the rigorous standards set by both the Atkins ruling and Texas law. Despite the arguments, the court was unmoved, as his IQ fell just above the established threshold for intellectual disability, which typically sets the boundary at an IQ of 70 or below. This discrepancy would become a key issue in his appeals. In 2024, the legal battles intensified. On September 29, 2024, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals made a critical decision, denying White's motion for a successive habeas petition. The court ruled that White's claim was time-barred, as the original decision had already been made years earlier, and no new compelling evidence had emerged to justify reopening the case. This ruling effectively closed the door on one of his most significant appeals, but White's legal team wasn't ready to give up. Just days before his execution, on September 27, 2024, a last-ditch effort was made. His attorneys filed an application for a stay of execution with the US Supreme Court, asking the justices to intervene and prevent the scheduled lethal injection. This was their final attempt to stall the execution based on claims of intellectual disability and unfair legal proceedings. But on October 1st, 2024, just hours before his execution, the US Supreme Court denied the application. With that decision, White's fate was sealed. His execution was cleared to proceed, and there would be no further delay. This legal struggle, spanning over 2 decades, highlighted the complexities of death penalty cases, particularly when mental health and intellectual disability are involved. While the legal team fought vigorously to have White's execution stayed, the courts focused on the specifics of Texas law and how it applied to White's case. They weighed his IQ score against the criteria set forth by both the US Supreme Court and the state of Texas. However, the full details of White's intellectual functioning, his childhood developmental history, and how these factors might have influenced his actions were never fully explored. The case was further complicated by questions surrounding the reliability of forensic evidence used in his conviction. The Houston Crime Lab, which had processed the evidence in White's case, had been at the center of controversy for mishandling evidence and producing unreliable results in the past. This added another layer of doubt to the case, but it wasn't enough to overturn the conviction. As his final day neared, the lingering uncertainty about whether White's intellectual disability truly met the criteria for exclusion from the death penalty only deepened the complexity of his legal struggles. Ultimately, despite the multiple attempts to delay his execution, the legal system was resolute. Garcia Glenn White's death sentence was carried out on October 1st, 2024, after years of appeals and legal battles. While the courts had ruled on the basis of his IQ and legal technicalities, the broader questions of whether justice had been fully served, especially in light of his mental health struggles, remained unanswered. For the victims' families, however, the case was a painful reminder of the long road to justice and the complicated process of determining when a person is fit to face the ultimate punishment. October 1st, 2024 marked the final chapter in the life of Garcia Glenn White, a man whose crime had haunted Houston for over 3 decades. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice Huntsville Unit, a place known for carrying out the ultimate punishment, would soon witness White's death. As the clock ticked closer to 6:56 p.m., the time set for his execution, a storm of emotions swirled in the air. Uncertainty, grief, and the weight of justice long delayed. White had spent the final hours of his life in the Polunsky Unit in West Livingston, a maximum security facility known for housing death row inmates. There, he lived his last moments in the solitary confinement of his cell. Prison staff and fellow inmates alike knew that the day would come, but few truly understood what awaited in the final minutes of his life. The prison was a quiet, tense place that day, a stark contrast to the loud echoes of the past he'd left behind, echoes that would follow him until his very last breath. Just hours before his death, White was moved from his cell to the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit, a procedure that was as routine as it was chilling. There, the reality of his situation fully settled in. This would be the place where his life, filled with violence and regret, would come to an end. Surrounded by prison officials, his last meal was served, a simple choice, reflecting the somber and final nature of the moment. White chose a meal that was minimal, a meal of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and iced tea. It was a request that, while not extravagant, spoke volumes about the man he had become. A man who had, by all accounts, chosen to live out his final moments in reflection rather than indulgence. As the execution neared, the emotional weight of the moment took over. White, known for his violent history, had shown signs of remorse in the days leading to his final hour. And when it came time for his final words, the man who had taken so much from so many chose to express regret for his actions. He began by apologizing to the victims' families, a gesture of sorrow that was long overdue. He spoke to the families of Bonita, Annette, and Bernette Edwards, acknowledging the pain he had caused them, a pain that could never be fully undone. In his final moments, White offered words not just to the victims' families, but also to the staff and inmates who had witnessed his long journey through the system. His apology, though expected, was only the beginning of his last statement. As the minutes ticked away, he turned inward, offering a quiet prayer of reflection. His voice broke the stillness of the chamber as he sang a hymn, "I trust in God." The song was soft, almost haunting, echoing through the chamber. It was a final attempt at redemption, a final act of faith, and perhaps a moment of peace before he faced the inevitable. At 6:56 p.m. CDT, White was pronounced dead. The execution had been carried out. The sentence that had been hanging over him for so many years was finally completed. His death was the culmination of a brutal past, a past that had left a trail of destruction in its wake. White's final moments, though peaceful in their execution, were a stark contrast to the violence of his earlier years. For some, the moment brought closure. For others, it only raised more questions. What if the legal system had moved faster? What if the evidence had been clearer sooner? Would more lives have been spared? Though his execution brought an official end to his story, the emotional aftermath remained far from settled. While the details of the prison process were routine, White's final meal, his statements, his transfer to the chamber, the emotional toll on his family and the victims' families remained a quiet, lingering presence. The Edwards family, forever scarred by the loss of their loved ones, could only process their own grief, while the state of Texas dealt the final blow to Garcia Glenn White. His last breath marked not just the end of his life, but also a moment of reflection for everyone who had been touched by the case. For some, it was justice finally served, while for others, it was a reminder of the years of waiting, the years of emotional turmoil that followed. The case would not be forgotten, nor would the impact it had on everyone involved. Garcia Glenn White's execution reignited debate over the death penalty, especially concerning intellectual disability claims and cold case murders solved decades later. His case raised questions about the fairness of the justice system, particularly in relation to the reliability of forensic evidence from the Houston Police Department's crime lab, which had a history of mishandled evidence. While some saw the execution as closure, for the victims' families, the long wait for justice, and the unresolved aspects of White's past caused lasting trauma. The 35 years between the murders and his execution highlighted systemic delays and inefficiencies in the death penalty process, leaving lingering doubts about the pursuit of true justice. This case resonates deeply with themes of crime, punishment, forensic science, and mental health law. Garcia Glenn White's execution raises critical questions. Was justice truly served, or did the system fail? Could there be more victims whose cases went unresolved for years? The complexities of White's intellectual disability claim, the reliability of forensic evidence, and the delays in administering justice highlight systemic flaws that have long-lasting impacts. We encourage you to reflect. Do you believe the death penalty is just? Was White's execution fair, considering his claims of mental impairment? Comment below with your thoughts on these critical issues. Thank you for watching this story until the end. If you found this one captivating, you're in for a treat with the next one. It's just as fascinating, if not more, than you could ever imagine. Don't miss out. Click on the image on your screen now to dive into the next story.